Ragamuffin Chronicles by Gilbert Arnold Savory. Chapter 1. Early Days, 1945 to 1955. My name is Gilbert Arnold Savory. I am the youngest son of Rose Savory nee Dixon, who was one of 7 children who lived in a cramped 2-bedroomed house. Mother was born 27th of June 1915 at number 12 Albert Place, Coroner's Quay, known as The Alley, North Wales. Dad, Arthur Savory, was born June 21st, 1913 in Garden City, Queen's Ferry. I was born on the 26th of November 1942 at number 10 Priestfield Road, Ellesmere Port. I have 2 brothers, Ronald Arthur and Frederick Carl, and a sister, Olwyn Merrill. Olwyn is the oldest. She was born the 10th of September 1936 in Shotton, North Wales. Ron is the next oldest. He was born 20th of November 1938. And Fred the next. He was born the 14th of July 1941. My early favourite childhood memories of Olwyn were of a pretty girl with sparkling eyes, soft, short, collar-length, light brown hair, fair complexion, and nicely positioned nose, ever so slightly bent to one side. Dressed in a one-piece dress with a small, heart-shaped collar buttoned on the neck and short, puffy sleeves. She was born with some fingers missing on both hands, but I can't remember noticing them as a child. Olwyn's major task at home was to look after me and keep me out of trouble. So I looked upon her as my second mother, and like the rest of the family loved her very much. Olwyn was a resilient girl. Even with only several fingers on each hand, no household task was beyond her capability. She could wash, cook, sew, knit, write and carry pots, pans full of hot water and even darn socks. There was no end to her domestic ability. In her teens, her best friend was Joyce Owens from across the road. They were the most caring girls I ever met, and I adored both of them. Ron had very wavy, almost curly, light brown hair, set on top of a smiley, round, angelic face. Usually quite a small-looking boy, who it appeared butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. He didn't seem to get into much trouble at home. That was left to me. Fred was the smarty one. He also had brown hair with a big quiff set in front. Fred was Mr. Right. He always had the answer. He was good at most things, so he tended to control me and Ron. Together, we were a close-knit family who looked after each other through thick and thin. When I was born, the Second World War had been in progress for 3 years and would carry on for another 3 years or so. I remember very little of the war, but can remember 1 or 2 things at the end of the war. For example, I remember the green metal respiratory, rather like a tin cradle, which was, for me, if there was a gas attack by the Germans. I remember lots of people in the street pointing up to hundreds of aeroplanes in the sky. I'm not sure whether these were German planes in the war going to bomb Liverpool or British planes flying to base after the war. I remember the air raid shelter outside our back door and a camp with camp beds in which later became the coal shed. I also remember a sign above our door saying, "Welcome home, Arthur," my dad. Other things like seeing from our Olwyn's bedroom window the sky light up in the direction of Liverpool when bombing was taking place. I'm not sure whether they are things I was told after the war or things I actually experienced. Whichever, they are firmly fixed in my memory. Dad was in the Royal Navy during the war and served on HMS Exford, a small destroyer. He never told us much about what he did in the war, but he did receive 6 champagne medals and a Pacific clasp, so he must have seen and been involved in some action. Dad had thick brown hair parted in the middle, each side forming a wave down to the ears. He had a slim face, square jaw, with handsome features and the looks of a man you could rely on. When not at work, he dressed very smart in sporty type clothes and would never go out unless he was well dressed. When I sat on his knee at home, he would brush my face with his spiky whiskers and make me scream with laughter as his rough unshaved face rubbed across my silky smooth cheeks. I think I got a giant share of his affection as I was the youngest. One of my early recollections of him was he often strapped a soft chair cushion to the crossbar of his bicycle with a trouser belt to form a seat for me to sit on, so he could take me for bike rides. I particularly remember one occasion on a hot sunny day when he pedal cycled up Prince's Road with me on the crossbar. We then went to Mill Lane, past Auntie Amy's house by Mill Lane School, then onto a cinder path which went downhill. The warm summer air whizzed past my face. At the bottom of the hill, we rode straight through a brook, water flashing out from the wheels like 2 fountains, and me yelling with delight. After the brook, he struggled uphill into Great Sutton until he came to Capenhurst Lane. At the corner of the lane, Grandad Savoury was sitting on a bench by a white metal railing, smoking his pipe. Grandad was wearing thick grey flannel trousers with turn-ups, a grey cardigan over a collarless shirt, and an old grey trilby on his head, covering his white hair. Dad lifted me off the bike and sent me to give Grandad a hug. Grandad looked exactly what you would expect a Grandad to look like in those days. A Grandad straight out of a storybook. It was the first time I had visited Granny and Grandad's house. It was a great adventure. They lived in a country lane, had a sheepdog and a few hens. The house backed onto farmland. It must have been sometime in July. The air was full of the sweet smell of freshly mown grass. You could hear the sound of the countryside, the hum of bees and hoverflies, the occasional flit of a dragonfly, and the welcome bark of Grandad's dog. We walked with Grandad a few hundred yards down the tree lane to his house, Dad pushing his bike and me holding Grandad's hand. When we went around the back of the house, Granny was in the kitchen with a cigarette in her mouth. She had grey hair cut at the nape of her neck and wore a flowered pinny. She had a kindly face and bent down to give me a kiss, followed by a cup of pop that made Dad and Grandad a cup of tea. Some of the grass in the fields was long and ready for mowing to make hay, and some already mown and lying in straight lines drying in the sun. At the back of Grandad's house, the grass had been woofled with a woofling machine, so the air could pass through it to get it thoroughly dry. It was the sort of hay that I wanted to play in. It was light, soft, and wonderfully sweet. It wasn't long before I had climbed the fence and was rolling about and burying myself under the dry hay's soft, sweet blanket. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, and Grandad called me out of the field in case the farmer saw me. What a wonderful day that was. I felt like life could go on forever and nothing would change. I would always be a boy. Me dad always strong and Grandad always there to visit. If only life could stand still. Dad was very strong in those days. He had muscles, the likes you'd never seen. He could suspend Fred and I in the air whilst we hung on the ends of his arms. I was told some years later that before he married Mum, he was part of a strongman act with another chap named Freddie Fullwood. Dad was good fun and cared for us very much. His main fault is that he could be very sharp with Mum, perhaps even nasty if she wasn't there at his beck and call. When he had a few beers, he was a barrel of laughs. I think he was probably a jealous man and always thought the worst if for some reason Mum wasn't there. One thing was certain, he wouldn't let the family go without. Mum was left to look after us during the war. My memory of her during the 40s was of her dressed in a floral crossover pinny, very pretty, slightly ruddy complexion and jet black hair, sometimes wearing a headscarf and always chasing after me. I remember her taking me to infant school and constantly pulling me away from the walls and railings we passed on the way, on which I dragged my free hand, the one she wasn't holding. By the time we reached the school gate, my right hand was the colour of the inside of our fire grate, and Mum would have to spit on a handkerchief to rub it clean before handing me to the teacher. Mum was always busy, either washing in the small corrugated wash tub or ironing with a flat iron, preparing meals, scrubbing floors, shopping, looking after the family, with the task of trying to make ends meet in very astute times. Wash day would start with boiling water in the large cast iron wash tub. The tub was set in a brick surrounding, with a small coal-burning fire grate underneath. The whole contraption was in the corner of the kitchen. When water had been heated in the tub, it would be then transferred into a freestanding galvanised wash tub into which the washing was dumped. Mum would then use a dolly stick to squiddle the washing around inside the tub, rather than a modern washing machine lying on its back, and the dolly peg swirling, the washing one way, then the other. After the washing was done, Mum would put it through a cast iron mangle. The mangle had 2 wooden rollers which turned in opposite directions and a large cast iron turning wheel with a wooden handle. Mum would feed the washing between the rollers with one hand and turn the great wheel with the other. As the washing was squeezed between the rollers, the water would wring out into a funneled channel down a rubber hose onto the yard, then down the drain. Once the washing was wrung through the mangle, she would hang it on the washing line, which ran the length of the yard, then prop it up with a wooden line prop. Mum's housework seemed endless. She was responsible for the preparation of all meals, black leading the fire range, black leading the fire range, red leading the red floor tiles in the front room, scrubbing the front doorstep. For what purpose, I don't know, even to this day. Every day you would see that woman in the street scrubbing the front doorstep. Noticeably, they never scrubbed the back doorstep. There was the washing, shopping, and seeing to us to contend with as well. And just to keep her busy, she also went to work. I remember Mum working at Robinson Thanes in Cromwell Road, where tin sheets were galvanised. She had a friend who lived in Beachfield Road named Mr. Roberts. I guess Mum was about 30-odd then. She would come from work with her friend. They both dressed pretty, much the same for work. Headscarf tied at the front with a sort of bow, dungaree overalls on top of a blouse, then often back to our house for a cup of tea and a natter. Often than weekends, when the men were at home, the main recreation for most women in the street was canting in each other's houses. Mum would say, "I'm just popping over to Annie Owens or Annie Jones's or into Flory Wainwright next door. groups of women neighbours would meet in each other's houses for a cup of tea and a natter. I'm assuming he meant women in the street were chatting, not canting. Borrowing cups of sugar or a few slices of bread off each other. Much of the food was on rationing. Most of the shopping was done at the two corner shops, Goodall's in Prince's Road and Biggs in Victoria Road. Both shops let women they trusted have food on the slate until payday. Mum and Dad liked to go for a drink on Saturday night, either at the Prince's Hotel in Prince's Road, where they would meet Auntie Ethel, or the Knot Hotel on the main road next to Woolworths. Occasionally, they would go to the White Swan in Great Sutton and drink with Grandad and Granny Savoury. Whichever pub they went, sing-songs were the main preoccupation, and raucous laughter and singing could be heard in every pub on Saturday night. Close neighbours had an odd way of addressing each other. If they were calling from a distance, they required a shout or call. They would use each other's surname. For example, if Annie Jones was calling Mum from across the road, she would shout "Savoury," and vice versa. Mum would call Jones. But when they were talking at close quarters, they would use Christian names, Rose or Annie, so you could often hear names called across the street in high-pitched voices. Savoury, Jones, Owens, and so on. With less attached neighbours, the women would add Mrs. So Mum, talking to Mrs. Jukes, would use her full title, Mrs. Jukes. Mum was a very caring person to her family, friends and neighbours, and was held in high regard by almost everyone she came into contact with. She would be called upon for all sorts of duties, laying out bodies of people who had died in the street, helping with births, diagnosing ailments and advising neighbours what to do. She was a leading light in her circle of acquaintance and a very loving mother to me. She was everything. My shelter, my comforter, and my mum.